She was forced to marry a Comatose CEO. Then he woke up and changed everything. It wasn't the wedding Lila Sanders had dreamed of. There were no flowers that smelled like spring, no friends cheering for her happiness, and certainly no love. Instead, there was silence, thick, suffocating silence. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the hem of her simple white dress. The mirror reflected a bride, but the woman staring back didn't look joyful or radiant. She looked scared. "Do you really have to go through with this?" Lila whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "We don't have a choice, Lila. If we don't do this, we lose everything." The words haunted her. It wasn't just her future at stake, it was her mother's too. Lila's father had died years ago, leaving them to scrape by on whatever her mother earned working as a maid for the Hopkins family. But no matter how hard Sophia worked, it was never enough. James Hopkins, her wealthy and controlling guardian, had made sure of that. When James brings up the idea of marrying Ethan Montgomery, Lila thinks it is a cruel joke. Ethan was a billionaire, powerful and untouchable, but he was also lying in a coma, his future as uncertain as hers. She wanted to refuse, to scream that this wasn't fair, but James had made the stakes clear. "You marry him," he said coldly, "or your mother is out on the streets." Lila hated James Hopkins, but she feared him more. He had taken her in after her father's death, parading himself as a savior, but every gift came with strings attached. Marrying Ethan wasn't about her or her happiness. It was about James securing his own position in the Montgomery family's good graces. "Don't think of it as a marriage," James had said with a smirk. "Think of it as an opportunity. You'll live comfortably, and Ethan will never even know you're there." But it wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. The morning of the wedding felt surreal. Lila woke up to her mother ironing the simple white dress James had chosen. "You're stronger than you think," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "We'll get through this." Lila nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She didn't feel strong. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The chapel was cold, and the whispers of the few attendees echoed louder than the organ music. Lila's footsteps felt heavy as she walked down the aisle, her mother's hand clutching hers for support. She couldn't bring herself to meet anyone's gaze. She didn't need to see their expressions to know what they were thinking. Look at her. She's just a nobody. Why would they let someone like her marry into the Montgomery family? This is all for show. Each step felt like she was walking closer to a trap she couldn't escape. When she reached the altar, her eyes fell on Ethan for the first time. He looked handsome, almost regal, in his tuxedo, but the lifelessness in his expression made her chest tighten. She had seen photos of him before, always commanding a room with his sharp gaze and confident smile. Now he was just, still, a man who had everything reduced to silence. The officiant's voice broke through her thought. "Do you, Lila Sanders, take Ethan Montgomery to be your lawful wedded husband?" Her lips felt dry, but she managed to force out the words, "I do." The ceremony ended as quickly as it began. No cheers, no applause, just silence. That evening, Lila found herself alone in the massive Montgomery mansion. She wandered through the hallways, feeling like an intruder. The walls were lined with expensive paintings and ornate furniture, but it all felt cold and impersonal. She was shown to a guest room, her room, but it felt foreign. There were no traces of her life here, nothing to make it feel like home. The emptiness of the mansion only deepened her sense of isolation. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. She hadn't expected to feel anything for him, but the sight of him lying so still had stirred something in her. Pity? Sadness? Guilt? She wasn't sure. She tried to distract herself by unpacking her small suitcase, but her hands were shaking too much. Finally, she decided to check on him. The nurses had assured her he was stable, but she felt a strange responsibility to see for herself. Ethan's private suite was as intimidating as the rest of the mansion. Machines beeped softly, monitoring his condition. Lila hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside. "Hello, Ethan," she said softly, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. She sat down beside his bed, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her dress. "I don't know if this will ever make sense to you, but I didn't want this either." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I didn't marry you for your money or your name. I married you because I had to protect my mother. She's all I have." Lila sighed and leaned her head against the edge of the bed. "I promise I'll take care of you. Even if you never wake up, I'll be here. That's the least I can do." She closed her eyes, exhaustion taking over. For a moment the world felt quiet, and then everything changed. A sharp gasp shattered the silence. Lila's eyes flew open, and her heart stopped. Ethan's chest was rising and falling rapidly. His fingers twitched, and then his eyes, those piercing ice-blue eyes, opened. For a moment neither of them moved. Lila's breath caught in her throat as his gaze locked onto hers, intense and unyielding. "Who are you?" he rasped, his voice weak but full of authority. Lila's mind raced. She had prepared for a lot of things, but this wasn't one of them. "I'm Lila," she stammered, "your wife." His brows furrowed in confusion, and then his expression darkened. "My wife." His tone was sharp. almost mocking. What kind of joke is this? It's complicated, she said, her voice trembling. Complicated. He tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through him. Why don't you start by telling me why I'm married to a stranger? Lila wanted to disappear, but she forced herself to stay calm. You've been in a coma, she explained. Your family arranged the marriage. Ethan's eyes narrowed. And you just went along with it. She swallowed hard. I didn't have a choice. If I said no, my mother would have lost everything. I did what I had to do. For a moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back against the pillows, his gaze never leaving hers. Do they think I'm some kind of fool? Lila flinched at the bitterness in his voice. I don't expect you to understand, she said quietly, but I made a promise. I'll take care of you, whether you trust me or not. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't trust her, she could see it in his eyes, but something in her words seemed to strike a chord. What neither of them realized at that moment was how much their lives would change. Ethan wasn't just trying to recover from his coma, he was unraveling the betrayal and secrets that had led him there. And while Lila didn't expect anything from him, she was about to find out that Ethan Montgomery wasn't a man who gave up easily. This was just the beginning. Ethan's awakening and Lila's determination. The air felt heavy in the room. Lila stood frozen by Ethan's bedside, her mind racing with a million thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan was supposed to stay unconscious, allowing her to live quietly in the shadows of this arrangement. But now his sharp, piercing gaze was locked onto her, demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. Who are you? Ethan rasped again, his voice hoarse but firm. I'm Lila, she stammered, her words barely audible. He blinked slowly, his confusion giving way to irritation. Lila, he repeated, testing the name. Am I supposed to know you? Lila's throat tightened. This was harder than she'd imagined. She tried to find the words, but none of them felt right. Finally, she forced herself to speak. I'm your wife, she said, her voice trembling. The room fell silent. Ethan's brows knit together in disbelief, and then he let out a weak, humorless laugh. My wife, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I must still be dreaming. No, Lila whispered, her voice shaky. You're awake, and we're married. Ethan tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his body, making him grimace. Lila instinctively reached out to help him, but he waved her off, his expression hardening. Don't, he said coldly. She pulled her hands back, feeling the sting of his rejection. She couldn't blame him for being angry or confused, she felt the same way, but she needed him to understand, even if only a little. You've been in a coma, she began, her voice soft but steady. Your family, they arranged this marriage while you were unconscious. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked away, his mind clearly racing. And you just went along with it, he asked bitterly, his voice low but sharp. Lila's chest tightened. She had expected this question, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. I didn't have a choice, she said quietly. My mother. She works for the Hopkins family. They threatened to fire her if I refused. His eyes snapped back to hers, his expression unreadable. So what? You married me to save your mother's job. Yes, Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She knew how it sounded, cold, calculated, heartless, but it was the truth. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. Then he let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head. Even in a coma, I'm just a pawn in someone else's game. The sound of the door opening broke the tension. Clara Montgomery, Ethan's aunt and the matriarch of the family, stepped into the room. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Ethan awake, but she quickly composed herself, her usual calm demeanor taking over. Ethan, she said, her voice warm but firm. You're awake. Ethan's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. Aunt Clara, he said, his voice still weak. What's going on? Clara glanced at Lila, her eyes narrowing slightly, before turning back to Ethan. It's a long story, she said gently, but for now you need to focus on recovering. The doctors will be here soon to check on you. Ethan didn't look convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. Clara turned to Lila, her expression unreadable. Lila, she said, her tone polite but distant. A word, please. Lila hesitated, glancing at Ethan, but he was already looking away, his jaw tight. She followed Clara out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Clara led Lila down the hallway, stopping near a large window that overlooked the estate's sprawling gardens. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the view. Then she turned to Lila, her expression unreadable. Ethan is awake, she said simply. Yes, Lila replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to see straight through her. He's not going to trust you, she said finally. Not right away. He's been through too much to take anything at face value. I know, Lila said quietly. I don't expect him to. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze softening slightly. Good, she said, because if you're going to stay here, if you're going to be his wife, you'll need to earn his trust, and that won't be easy. Lila swallowed hard, the weight of Clara's words settling heavily on her shoulders. I'll try, she said softly. I'll do whatever it takes." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see," she said simply. That evening, Lila sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the moonlit gardens below. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotion. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but now that Ethan was awake, the reality of the situation felt even more daunting. Her mind kept replaying their conversation, his cold tone and sharp words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would understand. But why would he? To him, she was just a stranger who had claimed the title of his wife without his consent. But she had made a promise to her mother, to herself, and now, in a strange way, to Ethan. She would stay. She would try. Even if he never forgave her, she would do her best to make this. In the other room, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His body ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anger. He couldn't believe this was happening. Married? To a stranger? It was absurd. And yet there was something about Lila that he couldn't quite place. She seemed sincere in a way that felt almost disarming, but he wasn't ready to let his guard down. Not yet. Ethan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening against the sheets. He didn't know who to trust, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let anyone take advantage of him. Not again. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible wall that neither of them knew how to break down. But beneath the anger and mistrust, there was something else, a spark of something neither of them fully understood. As the days turned into nights and the nights turned into mornings, their lives would become intertwined in ways they couldn't yet imagine. They didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of a journey that would test their strength, their trust, and their hearts. Because sometimes the most unexpected circumstances lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. Testing the waters. Ethan's investigation. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The walls of his bedroom felt too close, the air too thick. Every time he closed his eyes, Lila's trembling voice echoed in his mind. "I didn't have a choice." She had said it with such honesty, but that only made it worse. How could he trust a stranger? Someone who had agreed to marry him without his consent. From his bed, Ethan's sharp eyes scanned the room. It was pristine, just as he remembered, but something felt off. His life had been carefully controlled before the coma, and now it felt as if someone had taken over without his permission. He couldn't sit back and let this continue. He needed answers. The next morning, Ethan asked for his laptop. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Clara, who was standing by the doorway. "You need rest," Clara said in her usual calm tone. "You shouldn't strain yourself." "I need to catch up on what I've missed," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "Please." Clara sighed but nodded, signaling for the nurse to bring the device. Lila, who had just entered with a tray of breakfast, froze when she heard their exchange. "Ethan, you should eat first," she said softly, placing the tray on the table beside his bed. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I'll eat after I find out what's really been going on." Lila's stomach dropped. She could feel his distrust like a physical weight, but she said nothing, stepping back as Ethan opened his laptop and began typing. Hours passed, and Ethan barely looked up from the screen. Clara had left the room, but Lila stayed, sitting quietly in the corner. She wanted to give him space, but she also felt a strange sense of responsibility. After all, she was the one who had been thrust into his life without warning. Ethan's brows furrowed as he scrolled through email, financial reports, and news articles. He noticed gaps, moments when decisions had been made on his behalf. His trusted advisors had stepped in, claiming to act in his best interest, but something didn't sit right. And then there was Lila. He couldn't find any mention of her before the wedding. No photos, no introductions, nothing. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere. Finally, Ethan looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Why you?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Lila blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "Why did they choose you to marry me?" he demanded. "Out of all the people they could have picked, why you?" Lila hesitated. She had asked herself the same question countless times. I don't know," she admitted. "James Hopkins said it was the best way to secure the Montgomery family's favor." Ethan's jaw tightened at the mention of James. He didn't trust the man, not before the coma, and certainly not now. Later that day, Ethan called for Clara. Lila stayed in the room, standing awkwardly by the window as Ethan confronted his aunt. "Why didn't anyone tell me about this marriage?" Ethan asked, his voice cold. Clara met his gaze calmly. "You were in a coma, Ethan. Decisions had to be made." "Decisions," Ethan repeated bitterly. "So, you thought it was a good idea to marry me off to a stranger?" "It wasn't my decision alone," Clara replied evenly. "James suggested it, and the family agreed. It was meant to stabilize your position within the company and protect the family's reputation." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "Reputation? And what about my rights? Did those mean nothing?" Clara sighed, her composure faltering slightly. "You were vulnerable, Ethan. We did what we thought was best." Ethan shook his head, his frustration evident. What about her? He gestured toward Lila, who flinched at the sudden attention. Did anyone bother to ask her how she felt about being dragged into this? Clara glanced at Lila, her expression softening. She agreed to help us, Ethan. She made sacrifices to ensure this family's stability. That doesn't justify any of this, Ethan snapped. I deserve to know the truth. As the days passed, Ethan continued his quiet investigation. He started observing Lila more closely, looking for any signs of deceit, but the more he watched her, the more confused he became. She didn't act like someone who wanted to take advantage of him. She was polite, even timid at times, and she never pushed him for anything. If anything, she seemed to go out of her way to stay out of his way. One afternoon, Ethan caught her in the library, sketching in a note. She didn't notice him at first, her focus entirely on the page. He stepped closer, curious despite himself. What are you drawing? He asked, his voice startling her. Lila quickly closed the notebook, her cheeks flushing. Nothing, she said hastily. Just passing the time. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're an artist. Not really, she said soft. It's just a hobby. He didn't press further, but the moment stayed with him. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of the person behind the title of his wife, and for a brief second, he wondered if he had judged her too harshly. Ethan's suspicions were put to the test when he received a call from one of his business associates. There was a problem with a major deal. A rival company was trying to sabotage a project Ethan had been working on before his coma. Normally, he would have handled the situation with ease, but now, recovering and out of practice, he wasn't sure where to start. To his surprise, Lila offered to help. I know I'm not a part of your business, she said hesitantly, but I've worked with contracts before. Maybe I could take a look. Ethan frowned, his instinct telling him to refuse, but something about her sincerity made him pause. Reluctantly, he handed her the documents. Lila spent the next few hours poring over the papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally looked up, there was a spark of determination in her eyes. Whoever wrote this contract was clever, she said. But there's a loophole. If you adjust this clause and add an addendum here, you can counter their argument. Ethan stared at her, surprised. How do you know that? My father used to run a small business, Lila said quietly. I helped him with paperwork before he passed away. Ethan didn't know what to say. For the first time, he saw her as more than just an unwelcome stranger. She was smart, resourceful, and unexpectedly helpful. That night, Ethan sat alone in his room, staring at the revised contract. He hated to admit it, but Lila's suggestion had been brilliant. If this worked, it could save the deal and possibly the company. For the first time since waking up, he felt a seed of doubt about his initial judgment. Maybe she wasn't here to take advantage of him. Maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Ethan pushed it aside. Trust didn't come easily to him, and he wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. Still, he couldn't deny that Lila was proving to be more than he had expected. As Ethan prepared to face the challenges ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that Lila would play a bigger role in his life than he had anticipated. She was a puzzle, one he wasn't sure he wanted to solve, but one he couldn't ignore. And as the days turned into weeks, their uneasy alliance would be tested in ways neither of them could predict, because in the world of power, betrayal, and hidden agendas, nothing was ever as it seemed. Lila proves her worth. Lila stood at the edge of the mansion's grand dining room, clutching a stack of papers she had been organizing for Clara. It had been 2 weeks since Ethan woke up, and though he was more mobile now, their conversations were still stiff and distant. His sharp tone and suspicious glances told her everything she needed to know. He still didn't trust her, but today felt different. Ethan was seated at the far end of the table, a Bluetooth earpiece in his ear as he discussed something urgent with his legal team. His voice, though quieter than before his coma, carried authority. No, Ethan said firmly. If they can't meet the conditions we agreed on, then the deal is off. The call ended, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. Lila hesitated, unsure if she should approach him. He looked tired, like a man carrying more weight than he could bear. For a moment she felt a pang of sympathy for him. Lila, Ethan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. She jumped, nearly dropping the paper. Why, yes. Come here, he said, motioning to the seat across from him. Lila walked over cautiously, her hands tightening on the papers as if they were a shield. She sat down, waiting for him to speak. There's an issue with one of my contracts, he said, his tone clipped. I need a fresh set of eyes on it. Can you take a look? Lila blinked in surprise. Me? I mean, I'm not an expert or anything. I know, Ethan interrupted, his gaze steady. But you've helped before, and I want to see if you notice anything. Just try. Lila nodded, unsure why he was asking her, but grateful for the chance to prove herself. Ethan slid the contract across the table, and she began reading, her brow furrowing as she focused on the dense legal text. Minutes turned into an hour as Lila pored over the document. Ethan sat silently, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. Finally, she looked up, her eyes bright with realization. "There's a clause here," she said, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom. "It says they have the right to terminate the partnership without prior notice if certain conditions aren't met. But the conditions are vague. You could push back and demand clarification." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the section she indicated. "How did I miss that?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. Lila shrugged, trying to hide her nervousness. "Sometimes it's easier to spot things when you're looking from the outside." Ethan glanced at her, and for the first time since he woke up, there was no trace of suspicion in his eye. Instead, there was something else, something almost like respect. "Good work," he said quietly. "We'll use this to renegotiate." The next day, Ethan called Lila into his study. She had spent most of the morning organizing the household accounts, trying to stay out of his way. But when his message came, she couldn't ignore it. When she entered the study, Ethan was on another call, gesturing for her to wait. She stood near the door, her hands clasped in front of her, feeling out of place in the polished, masculine space. Finally, Ethan hung up and turned to her. "Close the door," he said. Lila's stomach tightened as she obeyed. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the intensity in his voice made her uneasy. "I need you to come with me to a meeting tomorrow," Ethan said, getting straight to the point. Lila blinked. "A meeting?" "Yes," he said. "It's with a potential client. They're difficult, to put it mildly, but they respect people who bring value to the table. I think your perspective could help." Her mouth opened, then closed again. "You want me to help? In a business meeting?" Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "You've proven you're more capable than I initially thought. I need someone who can think on their feet, and you've shown you can do that." Lila didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to refuse, afraid she would embarrass herself or worse, embarrass Ethan. But another part that had spent years yearning for a chance to prove herself felt a spark of excitement. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do my best." The following day, Lila found herself seated beside Ethan in a sleek conference room downtown. The potential client, a stern-looking man named Mr. Caldwell, was already firing off questions, his tone sharp and impatient. "This proposal is weak," Caldwell said, waving a stack of papers in the air. "You're asking for more than we're willing to give. Why should we even consider this?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Lila surprised them both by speaking first. "Because it's not just about what you're giving," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "It's about what you're gaining. This partnership isn't one-sided. It's an investment." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what, exactly, do you think we're gaining?" Lila glanced at Ethan, who nodded slightly, giving her the go-ahead to continue. She turned back to Caldwell, confidence growing. "You're gaining access to a market you've been struggling to break into for years," she said. "Ethan's company has the resources and reputation to make that happen, and if you're smart, you'll see that this deal isn't about short-term profits, it's about long-term growth." There was a moment of silence as Caldwell considered her words. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled. "You've got guts," he said, leaning back in his chair. "All right, let's talk specific." By the end of the meeting, Ethan had successfully renegotiated the deal, and Caldwell had left in a much better mood than when he arrived. As they walked back to the car, Ethan turned to Lila. "You were impressive in there," he said, his tone sincere. Lila felt her cheeks flush. "I just said what I thought made sense." Ethan shook his head. "No, you saw an opportunity and took it. That's not something everyone can do." For the first time since the wedding, Lila felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe this strange, forced partnership wasn't doomed after all. Maybe they could find a way to work together not as enemies, but as allies. But as they drove back to the mansion, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that this moment of peace wouldn't last. Ethan was still guarded, and she knew better than to assume his praise meant he fully trusted. There were still too many questions left unanswered and too many obstacles in their path. And in the shadows of their budding partnership, unseen forces were already at work, forces that would test their fragile alliance in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Because in their world, trust was a luxury few could afford, and betrayal was always just one step away. Midpoint the shift. Ethan sat in his study, staring at the stack of reports on his desk. The deal with Caldwell had been finalized earlier that week, and Lila's contribution still lingered in his mind. Her calm, confident approach had impressed everyone in the room, including him. But the question still gnawed at him. Who was Lila Sanders, really? He rubbed his temples, frustrated. Every answer she gave only led to more questions. She seemed sincere, even selfless at times, but a lifetime of betrayal had taught Ethan to be cautious. Trust was a rare commodity in his world. He looked up as Lila knocked softly on the door. "Come in," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Lila stepped inside, holding a folder. "I finished the inventory you asked for," she said, placing it on his desk. Ethan glanced at the folder but didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Why do you do it?" he asked suddenly. Lila blinked, caught off guard. "Do what?" "Go along with all of this," he said, gesturing vaguely to the room around them. "The mansion, the marriage, me." You could have walked away. Her hands tightened around the edges of her skirt. I told you before, she said quietly. I didn't have a choice. Ethan's eyes narrowed. There's always a choice. Lila hesitated, then sat down across from him. Maybe for someone like you, she said, her voice soft but firm, but not for me. Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. Explain. She took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on her hands. After my dad died, it was just me and my mom. She worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat. When James Hopkins offered to help, it seemed like a miracle, but it wasn't. Her voice faltered, but she continued. James always had strings attached. When he told me about the marriage, I knew it wasn't really a choice. If I said no, my mom would have lost everything, and I couldn't let that happen. For the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. She wasn't just a pawn in this game, she was a fighter, and she had sacrificed more than he realized to protect the people she loved. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. Lila looked up, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. Every day, she admitted, but I'd do it again if it meant keeping my mom safe. Ethan leaned back, considering her words. He still didn't trust her completely, but he couldn't deny that her story rang true, and as much as he hated to admit it, he admired her resilience. Over the next few days, their dynamic began to shift. Ethan was still guarded, but he started involving Lila in more of his work. At first, it was small tasks, proofreading reports, organizing schedules, but soon he found himself relying on her input. Lila, for her part, was determined to prove her worth. She knew Ethan was testing her, watching for any sign of weakness or deceit, but she also knew that this was her chance to show him who she really was. One evening they worked late into the night, preparing for a crucial presentation. Lila's quick thinking and attention to detail saved them from several potential mistakes, and by the time they finished, Ethan looked at her with something resembling genuine approval. You did well, he said, his voice lacking its usual edge. Lila smiled, exhaustion etched into her features. Thank you. As they packed up their work, Ethan noticed Lila glancing at a framed photo on his desk. It was a picture of him with his parents, taken years ago during a family vacation. Do you miss them? Lila asked hesitantly, nodding toward the photo. Ethan's expression softened, a rare glimpse of vulnerability breaking through his usual stoicism. Every day, he admitted. Lila hesitated, then said, My dad used to tell me that the people we love never really leave us. They're in the little things, memories, habits, even the way we think. It's like they're still a part of us. Ethan was silent for a moment, her words sinking in. Your dad sounds like he was a good man, he said finally. He was, Lila said, a sad smile on her lips. He always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. For the first time, Ethan felt a connection with Lila that went beyond their forced circumstance. It was small and fragile, but it was there. As the weeks passed, Ethan and Lila's partnership began to feel less like a facade and more like a genuine collaboration. They still had their differences, but there was a growing sense of mutual respect between them. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Ethan's return had disrupted the carefully balanced power dynamics within the Montgomery family. Some welcomed him back, but others saw him as a threat, and Lila, despite her best efforts to stay out of the spotlight, was becoming a target. One evening, as Ethan and Lila reviewed a set of proposals, Clara entered the room, her expression tense. We need to talk, she said, her gaze flicking between them. Ethan frowned. What's wrong? Clara hesitated, then said there's been a situation. Someone leaked sensitive information about the Caldwell deal to a rival company. Ethan's jaw tightened. Who? We're still investigating, Clara said. But whoever it was, they knew exactly where to look. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know much about the inner workings of the Montgomery family, but she knew enough to recognize the signs of betrayal. As Ethan and Clara discussed the situation, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced toward the doorway and saw one of the household staff lingering nearby, their eyes darting away when she... Later that night, as she walked back to her room, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Still, the unease lingered. The next morning, Ethan found her in the library, her sketchbook open on the table. You're quiet today, he said, sitting down across from her. Lila hesitated, then said, Do you ever feel like someone's watching you? Ethan raised an eyebrow. All the time. It comes with the territory. She frowned, tracing a pattern on the cover of her sketchbook. I don't know. It's probably nothing. Ethan studied her for a moment, then said, If something's bothering you, tell me. I'll take care of it. His words were simple, but there was an edge of sincerity that surprised her. For the first time, she felt like he was starting to see her as more than just a reluctant participant in his life. As they continued their work, the tension between them began to ease. But both of them knew that the peace wouldn't last. The leak was just the beginning, a warning of the challenges to come. For Ethan, it was a reminder that his world was full of dangers, both from outsiders and those closest to him. For Lila, it was a glimpse into the high-stakes reality of the Montgomery family, a world she she was now part of whether she liked it or not. And as they braced themselves for what lay ahead, one thing became clear: the fragile trust they had started to build would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The second turning point. The house was eerily quiet that evening. Lila sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the faint glow of the moon through her window. Something felt off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Tension from the Caldwell deal leak still lingered, casting a shadow over the mansion. Earlier that day, Ethan had been unusually silent. Normally, his sharp wit and pointed questions kept her on edge, but today he had barely acknowledged her presence. It wasn't anger, it was something deep, something guarded. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "Lila, we need to talk." Clara sat down across from her, smoothing her skirt as she carefully chose her words. "Ethan is convinced that someone within the household leaked the Caldwell information," she began, "and unfortunately your name has come up." Lila's heart sank. "What? Why me? I don't even know enough about the deal to leak anything." Clara raised a hand to calm her. "I don't believe it was you, but someone is trying to make it look like you were involved." "Why would anyone do that?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. Clara hesitated before answering. "You're new here, an outsider. It makes you an easy target, and some people see you as a threat." Lila frowned, confusion etched across her face. "A threat? To what?" Ethan, Clara said simply. "And to his position within the family." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lila had known her presence in Ethan's life wasn't exactly welcome, but she hadn't realized the extent of the resentment she faced. "Do you know who might have done this?" Lila asked cautiously. Clara hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the door, as if someone might be listening. "I have my suspicions," she said finally, "but nothing I can prove. Be careful, Lila. Whoever is behind this doesn't just want to hurt you, they want to hurt Ethan too." The next morning, Ethan called her into his study. His gaze was icy as he gestured for her to sit. "I'm going to ask you this once," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Did you leak the Caldwell information?" Lila's breath caught in her throat. "No," she said firmly. "I would never do that." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes searching hers for any sign of dishonesty. "Then explain why your name keeps coming up." "I don't know," Lila said, her voice shaking, "but someone is trying to set me up." "Why would anyone do that?" Ethan asked, echoing her earlier question. "Because I'm easy to blame," she said quietly. "I don't belong here, Ethan. Everyone knows that. And some people, they want me gone." Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. For a moment the room was silent, the tension between them almost unbearable. Finally he spoke. "I want to believe you," he said slowly, "but I've been betrayed before. I can't afford to take chances." Lila felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Then don't believe me," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Believe the fact. Look at the evidence." "I didn't do this, Ethan. You know I didn't." Ethan spent the next few days investigating the leak. He pored over emails, questioned staff, and reviewed security footage, determined to find the truth. Lila stayed out of his way, unsure if she should be relieved or worried by his silence. Late one evening, as she sat in the library sketching to calm her nerves, Ethan walked in. He looked tired, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "I found something," he said, holding up a stack of paper. "The leak didn't come from you." Relief washed over Lila, but it was short-lived. "Then, who was it?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "It was one of my cousins. They've been working with a rival company to undermine me." Lila's stomach churned. She had heard whispers about the Montgomery family's internal politics, but she hadn't realized how deep the betrayals ran. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it, but this is why I can't trust anyone." Lila looked at him, her heart aching for reasons she didn't fully understand. "You can trust me," she said softly. "I know I haven't given you much reason to believe that, but I'm not here to hurt you, Ethan." For a moment, his gaze softened. "We'll see," he said finally. In the days that followed, Ethan's demeanor toward Lila began to shift. While he was still guarded, he started involving her in more discussions. He asked for her input on business decisions and even sought her perspective on personal matters. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ethan found Lila in the kitchen making tea. She offered him a cup, and to her surprise, he accepted. "You don't have to do this, you know," Ethan said as he leaned against the counter. "Do what?" Lila asked. "Try so hard to prove yourself," he replied. "Most people would have given up by now." Lila shrugged. "Maybe I'm not most people." Ethan smirked, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "No, you're not." For the first time, the tension between them felt lighter. It wasn't gone entirely, but it was a start. But even as their bond began to grow, shadows loomed over the Montgomery estate. Ethan's investigation had uncovered more than just the source of the leak. It had revealed a web of deceit that threatened to unravel everything. Clara warned Ethan to tread carefully. "There's more at stake here than just your reputation," she said. "This family has enemies, and they're closer closer than you think." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right, but he also knew that the only way to protect what mattered was to confront the threats head-on. Lila, too, felt the growing tension. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test them both in ways they weren't prepared for. The climax: Lila's kidnapping and Ethan's revelation. The tension in the Montgomery estate was palpable. Ethan had grown more vigilant, his guarded nature intensifying with each passing day. Lila noticed it in the way he paced the halls at night, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice low but clipped. Something was brewing, something big, and though she didn't know the details, she felt the weight of it pressing down on both of them. "Don't let it get to you," Clara had told her over tea earlier that afternoon. "Ethan always assumes the worst in people. It's his way of protecting himself." Lila had nodded, but Clara's words offered little comfort. Ethan's mistrust wasn't just directed at the world, it was directed at her too, and that, more than anything, left her feeling isolated. That evening, as she walked through the dimly lit corridors on her way to the library, she noticed shadows moving near the front entrance. She paused, her heart racing. The staff had already retired for the night, and Ethan was in his study. Who could it be? Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept closer, her footsteps light on the polished floor. As she peeked around the corner, she saw two men, their faces partially obscured by the hoods of their jackets. They were speaking in hushed tones, their voices too low for her to catch their words. A chill ran down her spine. She should have turned back, but something compelled her to stay. Then one of the men turned and saw her. "Hey," he barked, his voice echoing in the quiet hall. Panic surged through Lila, and she bolted down the hallway, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She didn't stop until she reached Ethan's study, slamming the door behind her. "Ethan," she gasped, her voice trembling. "There are men in the house." Ethan shot to his feet, his expression hardening. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing the heavy paperweight from his desk as a makeshift weapon. "Lock the door behind me." "Wait," Lila cried. "You can't." But he was already gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Lila locked it as he had instructed, her hands shaking, minutes, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear anything, a shout, a scuffle, anything that would tell her what was happening. But all she heard was silence. Suddenly the door handle jiggled, and Lila's heart leaped into her throat. "Ethan," she called, her voice trembling. The door burst open, and two unfamiliar men stormed in. Before she could scream, one of them clamped a hand over her mouth, while the other grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her back. "Let's go," one of the men growled, dragging her toward the hallway. Lila struggled, her muffled cries echoing in the empty corridor. She twisted and kicked, her shoes scraping against the floor, but their grip was unrelenting. "Ethan," she managed to scream before they yanked her out of the house. Ethan found the intruders moments too late. The front door was wide open, the cool night air rushing in. He spotted the tire marks on the gravel driveway and knew immediately what had happened. "Lila," he muttered under his breath, his chest tightening. Without a second thought, he grabbed his car keys and sprinted to the garage. As he drove through the dark streets, his mind raced. He had been careful, so careful to protect her from the enemies that surrounded them, but he hadn't been careful enough, and now the one person who had stood by him, despite everything, was in danger. His phone buzzed, and he snatched it up, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The voice on the other end was distorted, but the message was clear. "If you want her back, you'll cooperate. No police. No trick." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Where is she?" "All in good time," the voice replied, a mocking edge to their tone. "You'll hear from us soon." The line went dead. Lila was blindfolded, her wrists tied behind her back. Cold, damp air told her she was in some sort of basement or warehouse. Her captors hadn't spoken much since bringing her here, but their occasional whispers sent chills down her spine. She replayed the events of the evening in her mind, trying to make sense of who were these men and what did they want. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. One of the men crouched in front of her, his face partially illuminated by the dim light overhead. "You're braver than you look," he said, his tone almost amused. "Bravery won't get you out of this." Lila glared at him, refusing to show fear. "What do you want from me?" The man chuckled. "It's not about you, sweetheart. It's about Ethan, and trust me, he'll do whatever it takes to get you back." Back at the Montgomery estate, Ethan was preparing for war. He had called in a favor from an old friend, a private investigator who specialized in high-stakes situations like. "They'll call again," the investigator said. "When they do, we'll trace the call and figure out where they're holding her." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenched. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, but he forced himself to stay focused. Couldn't afford to lose her. Not now. Not when he was finally starting to see what she meant to him. Phone rang again, and Ethan answered immediately. "Where is she?" he demanded. "You're not in a position to make demands," the voice replied. "But if you're so eager to see her, let's make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Ethan asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Your company," the voice said. Your position as CEO. Walk away, and we'll let her go. Ethan's heart pounded. His company was his life's work, the legacy his parents had left, but as he pictured Lila's face, her defiant spirit, quiet strength, he realized there was no choice to make. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Tell me where she is. The investigator gave him a nod, signaling that they had traced the call. Ethan grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. When he arrived at the warehouse, the scene was exactly as the investigator had described. Two guards stood outside, their postures relaxed. They didn't see Ethan coming until it was too late. Inside, Lila was sitting on the cold concrete floor, her blindfold still in place. When she heard the commotion, her heart leapt. Ethan, she called, her voice cracking. It's me, he said, rushing to her side. He untied her wrists and removed the blind, his hands trembling. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft. Lila nodded, tears streaming down her face. I knew you'd come. As they drove back to the estate, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Ethan spoke. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have protected. You did, Lila replied, her voice steady. You came for me. That's all that mattered. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You mean more to me than I realized, he admitted. And I'm not going to let anything happen to you again. Lila reached over, placing a hand on his arm. We'll face whatever comes next together. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he wasn't alone. Resolution, Ethan and Lila's new beginning. The ride back to the Montgomery estate was silent, the events of the evening hanging heavily between them. Lila sat in the passenger seat, her wrists red and tender from the ropes that had bound her. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping his phone as he made calls to secure the estate and gather more information about the men who had taken. The faint glow of the city lights flashed across his face, highlighting the tension etched into his features. Lila stole a glance at him, noticing how tightly he gripped the wheel. His usual composure was fraying at the edges, and it made her chest tighten. Do you think they'll come back? She asked quietly, breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Not if I can help. It wasn't just a promise, it was a declaration. For the first time since she'd entered his life, Lila felt the full force of Ethan's determination. He wasn't just protecting her out of obligation, he genuinely cared. By the time they returned home, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. Clara was waiting for them at the front door, her expression a mixture of relief and worry. Lila, are you all right? She asked, pulling her into a tight embrace. I'm fine, Lila replied, though her trembling hands betrayed her words. Clara turned to Ethan, her eyes narrowing. How could this happen? I told you the house wasn't secure. Ethan's expression darkened, his voice low and steady. It won't happen again. Lila watched as Ethan gave Clara a quick rundown of the night's events, his tone clipped and efficient. He was already planning their next steps, strategizing how to ensure their safety and uncover the full extent of the conspiracy against him. But as they spoke, Lila felt a strange sense of detachment. The events of the night had shaken her to her core, and though she was grateful to be back, she couldn't shake the feeling that she no longer belonged there. Later that morning, Ethan found Lila in the garden, sitting on a bench beneath the sprawling oak tree. She was staring at the horizon, her sketchbook open in her lap but untouched. Hey, he said softly, sitting down beside her. How are you holding up? Lila didn't look at him. I don't know, she admitted. It's hard to wrap my head around everything. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the trees swaying in the breeze. I know it's been a lot, and I know I haven't made it easier. It's not your fault, Lila said, finally looking at him. You didn't ask for any of this either. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I meant what I said last night, he began. You mean more to me than I realized, and I'm going to do everything I can to protect you. Lila felt her heart tighten at his words. You don't have to carry this alone, Ethan, she said quietly. I'm here, and I want to help. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes softening. You've already helped more than you know. In the days that followed, Ethan and Lila began working together to uncover the truth behind the attack. Ethan shared more about his business and the people involved, while Lila offered her insight and support in ways Ethan hadn't expected. One evening, as they reviewed documents in the study, Lila spotted a pattern in the financial reports that Ethan had overlooked. Look at this, she said, pointing to a column of numbers. These transactions, they're linked to the same account. Whoever's behind this has been funneling money out for months. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing as he studied the numbers. How did I miss that? He muttered. Sometimes it takes a fresh pair of eyes, Lila replied with a small smile. Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You're more than a fresh pair of eyes, he said. You're the reason I'm starting to believe I can trust someone again. Lila blushed at the compliment, her heart warming. It's a team effort, she said, trying to downplay her growing pride. However, not everyone in the Montgomery family was pleased with Lila's growing role in life. Whispers spread through the estate, fueled by jealousy and resentment. Some saw her as an outsider meddling in affairs she didn't understand, while others feared her influence over Ethan. One afternoon, Clara pulled Lila aside in the hallway. "You've done well," she said, her tone measured. "But be careful, Lila. This family, it has a way of chewing people up and spitting them out." Lila met Clara's gaze, her chin held high. "I'm not afraid of this family," she said firmly. "I'm here to stay." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good, because Ethan's going to need you more than ever." The breakthrough came late one night when Ethan received a call from his investigator. They had traced the financial trail to a rival company, confirming their involvement in the attack. "It's done," Ethan said. Hanging up the phone, he turned to Lila, his expression one of relief mixed with determination. "We have everything we need to take them down." Lila felt a surge of pride as she looked at him. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man beneath the guarded exterior, the man who had fought so hard to protect what he cared about. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Ethan said, "we fight back." The next morning, Ethan held a press conference, exposing the rival company's illegal activities and announcing a major restructuring within his own business. His words were confident and composed, but Lila could see the fire in his eyes, the fire of a man who had reclaimed control of his life. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Ethan reached for Lila's hand, squeezing it gently. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They were a team now, stronger together than they had ever been apart. That evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Ethan turned to Lila. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, his voice soft. Lila smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "We make a good team," she replied. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "We do, and I want you to know whatever comes next, I'm all in." For the first time in years, Lila felt a sense of belonging. She wasn't just Ethan's wife in the name, she was his partner, his confidante, and perhaps his future. As they sat together under the stars, the weight of the past began to lift. They still had challenges to face, but for the first time they faced them with hope. Together. Final transformation, a life rebuilt. The Montgomery estate buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. It wasn't the usual undercurrent of tension or rivalry that Lila had grown accustomed to. This was different, hope, almost celebratory. And at the center of it was Ethan, standing tall despite the battles he had faced, his presence commanding yet calm. Lila watched him from the balcony, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. She'd been working on a portrait of the estate's garden, but found her attention wandering to Ethan instead. He was in the courtyard, speaking with Clara and a few key members of his team. There was a lightness to his demeanor, confidence that hadn't been there before. "You're staring," Clara's voice came from behind her, startling Lila. "I'm not," Lila replied quickly, snapping her sketchbook shut, but the heat rising to her cheeks betrayed her. Clara chuckled, joining Lila on the balcony. "It's not a bad thing, you know. He's come a long way, and I think you had more to do with that than you realized." Lila glanced at Clara, unsure how to respond. "I think he's just finally learning to trust himself." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And you?" Over the next few weeks, the changes in Ethan became more apparent. He no longer retreated into his study for hours on end or avoided difficult conversation. Instead, he sought Lila's input on everything from business strategies to personal matters. It wasn't just about trust, it was about partnership. One evening, as they sat in the study reviewing plans for a new project, Ethan paused, looking at Lila thoughtfully. "You know," he began, "when this all started, I didn't think I could rely on anyone. I thought I had to carry everything on my own." "And now?" Lila asked, her tone light but curious. "Now," Ethan said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "I realize that having someone to share the load with doesn't make me weak, it makes me stronger." Lila's heart swelled at his words, but she tried to keep her tone casual. "Well, I'm glad I could help, even if it's just with the boring stuff like spreadsheets." Ethan laughed, a genuine, warm sound that filled the room. "You've done a lot more than that, Lila." Despite their progress, there were still ghosts from the past that needed to be addressed. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from his estranged cousin, the same one who had betrayed him. "Why would he reach out now?" Lila asked as Ethan relayed the news. "He's probably trying to save face," Ethan replied, his jaw. "But I'm not interested in making amends." Lila hesitated. "Maybe he's not looking for forgiveness. Maybe he just wants closure." Ethan frowned, considering her words. "Do you think I should meet with him?" "I think it's up to you," Lila said gently. "But carrying resentment doesn't hurt him, it hurts you." The following day, Ethan met with his cousin at a neutral location. Lila didn't know what was said during their conversation, but when Ethan returned, there was a weight lifted from his shoulder. "What happened?" she asked. I didn't forgive him, Ethan admitted, but I let go of the anger, and for the first time I feel free. With the rival company dismantled and the Montgomery family's internal struggles subsiding, Ethan turned his attention to rebuilding, but this time his vision wasn't just about business, it was about legacy. I want to create something lasting, Ethan told Lila one evening as they walked through the estate's gardens, something that goes beyond profits and power, like what Lila asked. Intrigued. A foundation, Ethan said. Something that supports artists, entrepreneurs, people who need a chance to make their dreams a reality. Lila's eyes lit up. That's incredible, Ethan. He smiled at her enthusiasm. I was hoping you'd say that. I want you to help me run it. Lila stopped in her tracks, stunned. Me, that you have an eye for potential, Ethan said, and a way of connecting with people that I don't. Together we could make something amazing. For a moment Lila couldn't speak. Then she nodded, a smile spreading across her face. I'd love that. Months later, the Montgomery Foundation was officially launched. The event was held in the estate's grand ballroom, with guests ranging from business leaders to local artists. Ethan and Lila stood side by side as they welcomed attendees, their partnership now a visible, undeniable force. You've outdone yourself, Clara said, pulling Lila aside as the evening progressed. The foundation is already making waves. It's not just me, Lila replied. Ethan deserves the credit. Clara smiled knowingly. He wouldn't have done any of this without you. As the night drew to a close, Ethan raised a toast to the future. This foundation represents more than just a new chapter for the Montgomery family, he said, his voice steady and confident. It's a testament to what's possible when we believe in each other and work together. The room erupted in applause, and Lila felt a surge of pride. For the first time, she truly felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. In the quiet aftermath of the event, Ethan and Lila found themselves alone on the estate's terrace. The city lights glittered in the distance, a reflection of the bright future ahead of them. Do you ever think about how far we've come? Ethan asked, breaking the silence. All the time, Lila admitted. Sometimes it feels like a dream. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. It's real, he said, and it's just the beginning. Lila smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. I'm glad we found our way here. Me too, Ethan said soft. I couldn't imagine it any other way. As they sat together under the stars, the weight of the past finally lifted. They had faced betrayal, danger, and doubt, but they had come out stronger together, and for the first time in years, the future felt bright. Epilogue strengthened bonds and new horizons. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the curtains of the Montgomery estate, illuminating the quiet calm of the house. Lila stood by the window in her art studio, gazing out at the sprawling garden below. Her easel stood to her right, partially finished painting, capturing the serenity of the morning. It had been 6 months since the chaos that had nearly torn their lives apart. Kidnapping, the betrayal, and the high-stakes battles that followed had felt like a storm that would never end. But now, standing in the soft glow of the morning, Lila felt a deep sense of peace. Behind her, Ethan entered the room, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. You're up early, he said, his voice warm and unhurried. Lila smiled, turning to face him. I couldn't sleep. Too many ideas swirling around in my head. Ethan chuckled, setting the coffee down on the windowsill. Good ideas, I hope. Always, Lila, her eyes twinkled. The Montgomery Foundation had become a beacon of hope in Ardenvale. Its programs for young artists and entrepreneurs were thriving, with people from all walks of life finding support and encouragement to pursue their dreams. Lila had thrown herself into her role as co-director, using her own experiences to connect with those who sought the foundation's help. One afternoon, as Lila walked through the foundation's gallery space, she stopped to admire a painting by a young artist named Marcy. The piece was bold and vibrant, a testament to the artist's passion and determination. You've really outdone yourself, Lila said, as Marcy approached, her face lighting up with pride. Thanks to you, Marcy replied. You're the one who believed in me? Lila shook her head. You did all the work, Marcy. I just gave you a nudge. Ethan joined them, his presence commanding yet approachable. Marcy's work is already attracting attention, he said. We might have to expand the gallery sooner than we thought. Marcy beamed at the compliment, and Lila felt a surge of pride. Moments like these made all the struggles worth. Not all wounds had healed, but progress had been made. Ethan's relationship with Clara had grown stronger as they worked together to rebuild the family's reputation. Even some of the more skeptical family members had begun to warm to Lila, though she still encountered the occasional cold shoulder. One evening, as they gathered for a family dinner, Clara raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, she said, her eyes meeting Lila's across the table, and to the people who make them possible. Lila felt her cheeks flush as the room echoed with agreement. For the first time, she felt truly welcomed, not just as Ethan's wife, but as a valued member of the Montgomery family. Later that night, Ethan and Lila sat by the fireplace in the library, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow over the room. A bottle of champagne sat on the table between them, the remnants of their quiet celebration. "To us," Ethan said, raising his glass. "To us," Lila echoed, clinking her glass against. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire filling the space between their words. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't been forced into this arrangement?" he asked, his tone contemplative. "All the time," Lila admitted. "But honestly, I wouldn't change a thing." Ethan smiled, a rare softness in his expression. "Neither would I." As the weeks turned into months, Ethan and Lila continued to build the life they had once thought impossible. The foundation flourished, their relationship deepened, and the scars of the past began to fade. One day, as they walked hand in hand through the garden, Ethan turned to Lila with a serious expression. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. Lila raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what does the future look?" "It looks like us," Ethan said simply, "building something that lasts together." Lila squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I like the sound of that." Back in her studio, Lila stood before her easel, adding the finishing touches to her latest painting. It was a piece inspired by the journey she and Ethan had shared, a vibrant blend of chaos and calm, of light and shadow. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. Ethan entered the room, his eyes immediately drawn to the painting. "It's incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "It's us," Lila replied, stepping back to look at the piece. "Our story." Ethan wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "It's a story I wouldn't trade for anything." As they stood together, the sunlight streaming through the window, Lila felt a sense of completeness she had never known before. Their journey had been anything but easy, but it had brought them here to a place of love, trust, and hope. And for the first time, Lila knew that their best chapters were still ahead.